Stay in your room, the cold husband said quietly, his voice as smooth and distant as winter glass. We are only married on paper. The words settled into the vast penthouse like a chill that no fireplace could warm. Amara Johnson stood in the middle of the marble hallway, still wearing the simple ivory dress she had borrowed for the ceremony only an hour earlier, her fingers lightly touching the gold band on her hand, as if she were making sure it was real. Across from her, Callahan looked exactly like the kind of man newspapers described in polished headlines. Tall, composed, and impossible to read, his tailored charcoal suit fitting him like armor, the city lights of Manhattan stretching behind him through 40-foot windows. To the outside world, he was a powerful businessman with a calm voice and an empire that reached from Boston to Chicago. Tonight he had become her husband, but the way he stood there made it clear that the word meant almost nothing to him. Your room is down the hall on the left. Ethan continued without raising his voice, already turning slightly, as if the conversation had ended before it truly began. You'll have everything you need. Staff will handle the rest. Amara nodded once, because there didn't seem to be anything else she could do. Only 3 days earlier she had been cleaning hotel suites on the Lower East Side, pushing a cart down narrow hallways that smelled like detergent and coffee. Now she stood in a penthouse larger than the entire apartment building where she grew up in Baltimore, surrounded by polished stone, quiet elevators, and a silence so perfect it felt rehearsed. The marriage contract had been clear. 1 year. No questions. No expectations. No interference in Ethan Callahan's life. In exchange, she would receive more money than she had ever imagined earning in 10 years of honest work. It was supposed to be simple. A legal arrangement. A solution to a problem neither of them wanted to explain. But standing there beneath a chandelier that glittered like a frozen constellation, Amara felt the strange weight of the moment pressing against her chest. Ethan paused before walking away and glanced back once, studying her with the detached curiosity someone might give a painting in a museum. His gray eyes revealed nothing warm, nothing cruel, only distance. This arrangement works best. If we keep things uncomplicated, he said. You have your privacy. I have mine. Amara gave a quiet nod again. I understand. For a moment the room fell completely silent except for the faint hum of the city far below, taxis moving along Fifth Avenue like streams of yellow light. Then Ethan turned and walked down the opposite corridor without another word, his footsteps soft against the marble floor until the sound disappeared entirely. Amara remained where she was for several seconds, listening to the quiet of a life she had never imagined entering. Slowly, she slipped the wedding ring from her finger and held it in her palm, staring at the reflection of the chandelier in its polished surface. 1 year, she reminded herself. Just 1 year. But somewhere behind the closed doors of the penthouse, Ethan Callahan had already begun to sense something he couldn't quite explain, the quiet presence of a woman who was supposed to be invisible, yet somehow had already changed the atmosphere of the entire home. Morning arrived quietly over Manhattan, pale sunlight slipping through the towering glass windows of the Callahan penthouse and spreading across floors of cool white marble. Amara Johnson woke slowly, unsure for a moment where she was, her eyes adjusting to a bedroom that looked more like a luxury hotel suite than any place someone actually lived. The bed beneath her was enormous, dressed in soft gray linens that probably cost more than the furniture in her old apartment. For a few seconds she remained still, listening. The penthouse was silent. No traffic noise reached this high above the streets. Only the distant hum of the city far below, a soft reminder that millions of people were already beginning their day. Amara sat up and placed her feet on the polished floor, the chill of the marble instantly waking her senses. She glanced at the nightstand where the wedding ring rested exactly where she had placed it hours earlier. The gold circle reflected the morning light, small and perfect, like a symbol that carried far more meaning to the outside world than it did inside this apartment. 1 year, she reminded herself again. 1 year of quiet cooperation. 1 year of being invisible. That had been the agreement. She dressed simply, choosing a soft navy sweater and black trousers from the neatly arranged closet that had somehow been filled with clothing in her exact size overnight. Everything about the place was efficient, organized, and strangely impersonal, as if the penthouse had been designed for comfort but not for warmth. When she stepped into the hallway, the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air, guiding her toward the enormous kitchen that overlooked the skyline. Stainless steel counters gleamed beneath soft lighting, and a breakfast tray sat neatly arranged on the island, complete with toast, fruit, and a steaming mug of coffee. There was no one else in the room. Amara hesitated before approaching the counter, half expecting someone to appear and explain the rules she had not yet learned. Instead, she found a small envelope resting beside the plate. Her name was written on it in precise handwriting. Amara opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper with only a few lines written across the center. Your schedule is your own. Staff will assist if needed. Privacy is expected from both sides of this arrangement. Ethan Callahan. The message was polite, almost formal, like something sent between business partners rather than two people who had stood in front of a judge the night before and signed a marriage certificate. Amara folded the paper slowly and looked out toward the skyline, the morning sun now turning the glass towers of Manhattan into bright ribbons of gold. Somewhere else in the city, Ethan Callahan was already beginning another day of meetings, contracts, and decisions that moved millions of dollars with a single signature. Yet inside this quiet penthouse, he had left behind a stranger who technically carried his last name but knew almost nothing about him. Amara took a sip of the coffee and felt the warmth settle in her chest. She had agreed to this life for a reason, and that reason had not changed overnight. Still, as she stood there watching the sunlight climb higher over the city, she could not ignore the strange feeling that this silent arrangement might become far more complicated than either of them had expected. By late afternoon, the quiet rhythm of the penthouse had already begun to reveal its unspoken rules. Amara Johnson spent most of the day exploring the space carefully, moving through wide hallways and sunlit rooms with the cautious curiosity of someone who did not yet believe she truly belonged there. The Callahan penthouse stretched across nearly the entire top floor of the building. More than 8,000 square feet of glass, marble, and polished wood overlooking Central Park. Every room seemed designed for elegance rather than comfort. A formal dining room stood untouched with a table large enough for 12 guests, yet not a single chair appeared to have been used recently. A library lined with dark walnut shelves held rows of perfectly arranged books, their spines untouched by fingerprints. Even the living room, framed by a wall of windows that displayed the Manhattan skyline like a living painting, felt more like a showroom than a home. By 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Amara had learned something important about Ethan Callahan without ever seeing him again. His life moved with quiet precision, but almost no presence. Staff members appeared only when necessary, moving through service entrances like shadows. A house manager named Margaret briefly introduced herself before explaining that the penthouse operated on a simple expectation. Privacy was the highest rule. After Margaret left, the apartment returned to silence once again. Amara found herself standing near the windows in the main living area, watching the slow movement of people in Central Park nearly 40 floors below. From this height, the joggers and families looked like small moving pieces in a carefully arranged city map. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine how strange her life must look from the outside now. Only 1 week earlier, she had been pushing a housekeeping cart through narrow hotel corridors on the Lower East Side, cleaning rooms that guests rarely noticed twice. The scent of laundry detergent had followed her everywhere, and her entire apartment had measured barely 600 square feet. Now she stood in a home that felt almost as large as the entire floor of that building. But the memory that truly stayed with her was not the small apartment or the hotel hallways. It was the conversation that had changed everything. 3 days earlier, she had been finishing her shift when a manager quietly informed her that someone was waiting in the office downstairs. When she walked in, she had expected another guest complaint or perhaps a scheduling discussion. Instead, she had found Ethan Callahan standing beside the window, his posture calm and confident, the same controlled presence she had seen only on business magazine covers before. He had spoken with the same composed tone. He used the night of the wedding. Direct, efficient, almost detached. He explained that he required a wife for a very specific purpose. A legal marriage that would remain private and strictly contractual. 1 year. No expectations beyond discretion. In return, he would offer financial security that would change her life permanently. Amara remembered the moment she realized he was serious. Not joking. Not testing her. Completely certain. When she asked him why he had chosen her, Ethan had answered with quiet honesty. Because you do not ask unnecessary questions. Now as the afternoon sunlight slowly shifted across the living room floor, Amara wondered if that single reason had truly been enough to connect two strangers whose lives had never been meant to cross. Evening settled slowly over Manhattan, the sky fading from pale gold to deep blue as the lights of the city began to glow beneath the towering glass walls of the Callahan penthouse. By 6:30 the apartment remained as quiet as it had been all day, the stillness broken only by the soft ticking of a clock somewhere in the hallway. Amara Johnson had spent most of the afternoon reading through the documents Ethan had provided earlier that week, papers outlining the exact structure of their unusual arrangement. The contract was precise, almost surgical in its clarity. 1 year of legal marriage beginning immediately. Financial compensation transferred in scheduled installments. Mutual respect for personal privacy. Public appearances only when absolutely necessary. As she placed the papers neatly back into their envelope, Amara realized that every line of the agreement had been written with the careful logic of someone who built his life around control. Ethan Callahan did not seem like a man who allowed uncertainty into his plans. The quiet sound of the elevator opening at the far end of the hallway pulled her attention toward the entrance of the penthouse. A few seconds later the door opened and Ethan stepped inside, removing his suit jacket as he walked in with the calm efficiency of someone who had already completed a dozen decisions before sunset. His tie was loosened slightly, and the faint glow of the city lights reflected against the windows behind him. For a brief moment he appeared almost surprised to see her standing near the living room window, as if he had expected the apartment to remain empty. Amara gave a polite nod. Ethan acknowledged her presence with the smallest pause before crossing the room toward the kitchen counter where another neatly arranged tray had appeared sometime during the evening. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned lightly against the counter, studying the skyline for several seconds before speaking. You received the documents this afternoon. His voice carried the same composed tone she remembered from their first conversation. Amara nodded. Yes, I read them carefully. And the single word hung in the quiet room like a question waiting to be completed. Amara chose her answer carefully. Everything seems very clear. Ethan watched her for a moment, as if measuring whether she truly meant those words. Then he nodded once, apparently satisfied. Clarity prevents misunderstandings. He took a sip of water and set the glass down. There will be occasions when appearances matter. Business dinners, charity events, situations where it benefits both of us to appear convincing. Amara understood immediately what he meant. The outside world would see a successful marriage. The inside world would remain exactly as it had been since the ceremony. Separate rooms, separate lives, separate expectations. That is part of the agreement, she replied quietly. Ethan studied her again with the calm expression of someone used to reading people quickly. Most individuals would have asked questions by now, he said. About money, about my family, about why this arrangement exists at all. Amara looked out at the glowing skyline once more before answering. I assumed you would explain only what you believed was necessary. For the first time since he entered the room, Ethan allowed the faintest hint of something thoughtful to pass across his expression. Perhaps he had chosen correctly after all. Yet as the evening shadows deepened across the penthouse floor, neither of them realized that this carefully structured arrangement was already beginning to shift in ways no contract could fully control. The following morning the penthouse felt slightly less unfamiliar, though the silence still carried a strange weight that reminded Amara Johnson she was living inside someone else's carefully controlled world. Sunlight stretched across the marble floors again, reflecting softly against the tall glass walls as the city slowly came alive 40 floors below. By 8:30 she had already finished breakfast and was standing near the long kitchen island when the quiet hum of the elevator returned. A moment later the doors opened and Margaret, the house manager, stepped inside with her usual calm efficiency. She offered Amara a respectful nod before placing a slim folder on the counter. Mrs. Callahan, this arrived early this morning. Amara hesitated slightly when she heard the name spoken aloud. The title still sounded unfamiliar, like a role she had stepped into before fully understanding the script. Thank you, Margaret, she replied gently. After the house manager disappeared back through the service hallway, Amara opened the folder and found a printed invitation embossed on thick ivory paper. The message was brief but formal. The Callahan Foundation would host its annual charity gala the following evening at the Metropolitan Grand Ballroom. Attendance of Ethan Callahan and his wife was requested. Amara read the lines twice, understanding immediately that this was one of the moments Ethan had mentioned the night before. A public appearance. A situation where the outside world would expect a convincing marriage. She set the invitation down and looked toward the skyline again, wondering how many eyes in that ballroom would study her closely, trying to understand the unexpected woman who had suddenly appeared beside one of the city's most private businessmen. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned earlier than the day before. The elevator doors opened at 4:15, and he stepped into the penthouse carrying the same composed energy that seemed to follow him everywhere. His dark coat was draped over one arm, and a thin leather portfolio rested in his hand. When he noticed the invitation sitting on the kitchen counter, he gave a small nod, as if confirming that an expected development had arrived on schedule. "I assume you saw the gala invitation," he said calmly while setting the portfolio down. "Yes," Amara replied. "Tomorrow evening." Ethan leaned lightly against the counter, studying her for a moment the same way someone might evaluate a new business partner before an important meeting. "It will be our first appearance together since the marriage certificate became public record this morning," he explained. "That means people will be curious. They will ask questions." Amara folded her hands gently in front of her. "What kind of questions?" Ethan gave the faintest smile, though it carried more strategy than humor. "The kind that wealthy people enjoy asking when they believe they are being polite. How we met. How long we have known each other. Whether married life suits us." His gray eyes moved toward the skyline briefly before returning to her. "The important thing is that we appear comfortable standing beside one another." Amara considered his words carefully before answering. Comfort can sometimes be convincing even when the story behind it is simple. Ethan studied her again, noticing the quiet confidence in the way she spoke. For the first time, he seemed to realize that this arrangement might not unfold as predictably as he had planned. Outside the windows, the city lights were already beginning to glow, and somewhere beyond the glass walls 1,000 conversations were already preparing to judge the marriage neither of them truly understood yet. The following evening arrived with the quiet elegance of a city that never truly slowed down, and by 7 o'clock the lights of Manhattan stretched endlessly beyond the towering windows of the Metropolitan Grand Ballroom. The building stood only a few blocks from Central Park, its marble entrance glowing beneath rows of warm golden lamps as Blacktown cars arrived one after another along the curb. Inside, the annual Callahan Foundation Gala had already begun to gather the city's most familiar names in business, philanthropy, and society. Soft music drifted through the enormous ballroom, while servers moved between round tables draped in white linen, each centerpiece reflecting crystal chandeliers that hung nearly 30 feet above the polished floor. Conversations blended into a steady hum of polite laughter and quiet observation, the kind of carefully managed atmosphere where every smile carried a small measure of curiosity behind it. At precisely 7:25, another car arrived at the front entrance. The driver stepped out first, opening the rear door as Ethan Callahan emerged with the same composed presence that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. His dark suit was perfectly tailored, the subtle shine of cuff links catching the light as he straightened his jacket. A moment later, Amara Johnson stepped out beside him, her evening dress a simple deep navy that contrasted beautifully against the warm lights of the entrance. For a brief second, Ethan glanced at her as they stood together on the sidewalk, measuring the quiet confidence in the way she carried herself. "Ready?" he asked calmly. Amara met his gaze without hesitation, as ready as someone can be when an entire room is waiting to decide what they think about her. The corner of Ethan's mouth moved slightly, almost approving the honesty in her answer. Inside the ballroom, several conversations slowed as the couple entered together. Ethan Callahan was a familiar presence at events like this, but the woman walking beside him was not. Curious eyes followed them almost immediately, subtle glances exchanged between guests who had read the headlines earlier that morning. The marriage had appeared suddenly, announced through a brief public record that offered almost no explanation. Ethan acknowledged a few quiet greetings as they moved across the room, his posture relaxed but controlled. Amara walked beside him with calm composure, though she could feel the attention around them like a soft current moving through the air. A woman in a silver evening gown approached first, her expression warm but unmistakably inquisitive. "Ethan," she said with practiced politeness, "it is wonderful to see you again. And you must be the mysterious Mrs. Callahan everyone is talking about." Amara offered a gentle smile. "I am beginning to realize how quickly news travels in this city." The woman laughed softly, clearly pleased by the response. Ethan watched the exchange carefully, noticing how naturally Amara held the conversation without appearing intimidated. Another guest soon joined them, then another, each introduction carrying the same polite curiosity. For the first time since the arrangement had begun, Ethan began to sense something he had not expected when he created this carefully structured marriage. Standing beside Amara Johnson did not feel like a performance. It felt surprisingly effortless. The ballroom continued to glow with quiet elegance as the evening unfolded, the steady murmur of conversation rising and falling beneath the soft music drifting from a small orchestra near the stage. Crystal glasses reflected the warm light of the chandeliers while guests moved gracefully between tables, their voices blending into a polite rhythm of business, charity, and curiosity. Ethan Callahan and Amara Johnson stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the city, the skyline stretching endlessly beyond the glass like a living painting of silver lights and dark blue sky. For nearly 20 minutes, they had greeted a steady stream of acquaintances, investors, and foundation supporters, each introduction carrying the same careful politeness. Ethan handled the conversations with practiced ease, offering calm responses and brief smiles while guiding the exchanges with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being the center of a room without needing to demand attention. Yet tonight, he noticed something unexpected. Amara did not fade into the background the way many people assumed she might. Instead, she listened attentively, answering questions with simple confidence, her voice steady and thoughtful without ever revealing more than necessary. Several guests seemed quietly impressed by her composure, though a few others studied her with expressions that suggested curiosity had not yet turned into acceptance. The moment of tension arrived when a tall woman in an elegant ivory gown approached their table, her posture confident and unmistakably familiar with Ethan. Her name was Charlotte Whitmore, a well-known figure in several charity boards, and someone whose presence immediately shifted the atmosphere of the conversation. "Ethan," Charlotte said smoothly, her smile poised with perfect social precision. "It has been a while." Her eyes moved briefly toward Amara before returning to Ethan with a look that carried the faintest trace of surprise. "I see the city newspapers were not exaggerating." Ethan inclined his head politely. "Charlotte, it is good to see you again." Charlotte studied Amara more openly now, the polite smile remaining on her face but the curiosity in her eyes sharpening slightly. "Mrs. Callahan," she said slowly, extending her hand. "You have certainly arrived in New York society rather quickly." Amara accepted the handshake with calm grace. "Sometimes life moves faster than we expect." Charlotte laughed softly, though her gaze lingered a moment longer than necessary. "I imagine it must have been quite a surprise for everyone when Ethan suddenly announced a marriage." She turned slightly toward him again. "You were always very particular about privacy." Ethan remained composed. "Some decisions are simply made at the right time." Charlotte nodded, though the faintest trace of skepticism lingered in her expression. "Of course." She looked at Amara once more. "I hope the city is treating you kindly so far." New York can be very observant when someone new appears beside one of its most recognizable names. Amara held her gaze with quiet confidence. Observant cities often teach people how to stand a little straighter. For a brief moment Charlotte seemed unsure how to respond. Ethan noticed the exchange carefully, recognizing something he had not anticipated when he created the arrangement. Amara was not simply enduring the attention surrounding them. She was meeting it with a calm strength that made even experienced social figures pause. As Charlotte moved on to greet other guests, Ethan glanced at Amara again with thoughtful curiosity. For the first time that evening, he began to wonder if the woman standing beside him might change far more than just the public story of his life. The music in the ballroom shifted into a softer melody as the evening continued, the steady glow of chandeliers reflecting across rows of polished glassware and white linen tables. Conversations drifted through the room in quiet waves, but beneath the elegant atmosphere, something subtle had changed. Word had already begun to travel across the ballroom about the unexpected woman standing beside Ethan Callahan. Curious glances appeared more frequently now, and small groups of guests occasionally paused mid-conversation just long enough to observe the couple again before returning to their own discussions. Amara Johnson noticed the attention but refused to let it alter the calm rhythm of her movements. She listened politely as another foundation supporter described the charity's latest educational programs, nodding with genuine interest while Ethan occasionally added a thoughtful comment. To anyone watching from across the room, the pair appeared composed and perfectly balanced, their presence fitting naturally into the evening's polished atmosphere. Yet Ethan had begun to notice something far more quietly remarkable. Amara never tried to dominate a conversation, but she also never retreated from one. When guests asked about the foundation's work, she listened carefully and responded with thoughtful questions that suggested she actually cared about the answers. A few people who had initially approached with curiosity now seemed genuinely engaged in speaking with her. One older gentleman from the board even laughed warmly after she offered a brief observation about how real charity often begins with simple attention rather than large announcements. Ethan watched this unfold with growing interest. The woman he had chosen precisely because she asked few questions was now drawing quiet respect from people who were rarely impressed by anyone new. Eventually, the music paused and a soft chime echoed through the ballroom, signaling the beginning of the evening's formal presentation. Guests gradually moved toward their assigned tables, the soft rustle of evening gowns and polished shoes filling the room. Ethan guided Amara toward their table near the front of the ballroom, where several prominent foundation supporters were already seated. As they took their seats, Amara glanced toward the stage where a large screen displayed photographs of the foundation's work across several cities. Children reading in newly built libraries, community centers opening their doors, volunteers organizing food programs. The images carried a warmth that contrasted sharply with the polished formality of the ballroom. Amara leaned slightly toward Ethan and spoke quietly, so only he could hear. These programs actually help a lot of people. Ethan turned his head, mildly surprised by the sincerity in her voice. That is the intention. Most large organizations say the same thing, she replied softly, but it is not always true. Ethan studied her expression for a moment. She was not speaking to impress anyone. She simply believed what she was saying. For the first time that evening, Ethan felt a small shift in his carefully organized expectations. The arrangement had been designed to create a believable appearance in public settings. But as the lights dimmed slightly and the presentation began on stage, he realized that the woman sitting beside him was not playing a role at all. She was simply being herself, and somehow that authenticity was making the performance of their marriage far more convincing than any script he could have planned. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the presentation on stage continued, the large screen now displaying quiet scenes of new schools, community centers, and families whose lives had been touched by the Callahan Foundation. The audience listened with polite attention, though the atmosphere of elegance and quiet observation never truly disappeared. At the front table, Ethan Callahan sat with his usual calm posture, his expression composed while the speaker described the foundation's long-term goals. Yet his attention drifted occasionally toward the woman beside him. Amara Johnson watched the presentation with genuine focus, her eyes following each photograph with a quiet curiosity that seemed very different from the polished expressions worn by many of the other guests. When a short video began playing on the screen, showing volunteers helping children set up a new reading program in a small neighborhood library, Amara leaned forward slightly in her chair. The moment was subtle, but Ethan noticed it immediately. "You seem interested," he said quietly so the surrounding guests could not hear. Amara nodded softly. "Programs like that can change more than people expect. When children feel seen, they grow differently." Ethan considered her words for a moment. "Most people here would describe the program in terms of numbers and donations," he said. "You described it in terms of attention." Amara allowed a small, thoughtful smile. Attention is something many people never receive until it is too late. Ethan looked back toward the stage, but her words stayed with him longer than he expected. When the presentation ended, polite applause filled the ballroom and the lights brightened once more. Guests resumed their conversations, waiters quietly refilling glasses and clearing plates as the evening shifted into a more relaxed rhythm. A middle-aged man seated across from them leaned slightly toward Amara with an approving nod. "That was a thoughtful observation you made earlier about community programs," he said warmly. May I ask what field you worked in before joining Ethan's world so suddenly? The question was simple, but the surrounding table grew a little quieter, curiosity rising once again. Amara answered calmly. Hospitality services. I worked in a hotel for several years. The man looked mildly surprised, but not dismissive. That explains your attention to people, he said with a gentle smile. Many executives forget that detail entirely. Ethan listened to the exchange without interrupting. For the first time since the marriage had been announced, he noticed that Amara never tried to hide where she came from. She spoke about it without embarrassment or apology, as if the experience itself carried its own quiet value. Across the ballroom, Charlotte Whitmore stood near another table speaking with several guests, though her gaze occasionally drifted back toward Ethan and Amara with careful interest. Something about the evening was unfolding differently than many people had expected. The mysterious wife beside Ethan, Callahan, had not appeared uncomfortable under scrutiny. Instead, she had met every conversation with calm presence, slowly replacing curiosity with a kind of quiet respect. Ethan leaned back slightly in his chair, watching the room with thoughtful eyes. The arrangement had been designed to create a convincing public image. Yet as the evening continued, he realized something unexpected had begun to happen. The woman beside him was not simply helping him maintain a story. She was quietly reshaping how that story was being received. The evening continued to unfold with the steady rhythm of polite conversation and quiet observation, the ballroom glowing warmly beneath its tall crystal chandeliers, while the orchestra resumed a gentle melody in the background. Guests slowly rose from their tables, drifting across the polished floor with glasses of sparkling water or wine in hand as the formal program gave way to relaxed networking. Ethan Callahan stood beside Amara Johnson near the edge of the ballroom, the skyline of Manhattan visible beyond the tall glass doors that opened toward a balcony overlooking Central Park. From this vantage point, the city lights stretched endlessly into the distance, a quiet reminder of the enormous world that existed beyond the carefully controlled environment of the gala. Several more guests approached them over the next few minutes, each conversation unfolding with the same mixture of curiosity and courtesy that had followed them all evening. Ethan answered questions about the foundation's future projects while Amara listened attentively, occasionally offering thoughtful remarks that surprised people who had expected her to remain silent beside him. One guest, a retired school principal named Daniel Harper, spoke with particular enthusiasm about the reading program shown earlier during the presentation. When he described the challenges many children faced in communities without strong educational support, Amara listened carefully before responding with a quiet observation about how encouragement from even one adult could change the direction of a young person's life. The comment was simple, but it carried a sincerity that made Daniel nod with genuine respect. Ethan noticed the reaction immediately. For the second time that evening, he found himself studying Amara not as a partner in a contractual arrangement, but as an individual whose perspective added something meaningful to the conversations around them. Across the room, Charlotte Whitmore remained engaged with several influential guests, though she occasionally glanced toward Ethan with the thoughtful expression of someone reconsidering a situation she had initially dismissed. The ballroom had begun the evening expecting to quietly analyze the mysterious woman who had suddenly become Mrs. Callahan. Instead, many of those same observers now appeared to be adjusting their impressions in real time. After Daniel excused himself to greet another colleague, Ethan turned slightly toward Amara as they stood near the balcony doors. You handled that conversation well, he said calmly. Amara gave a small smile. He seemed passionate about helping those children. Passion deserves to be taken seriously. Ethan considered her answer for a moment before speaking again. Most people in this room approach these events as professional obligations. You do not seem to view it that way. Amara looked toward the lights of the city for a moment before replying. When someone grows up in a place where small opportunities matter, programs like these stop feeling abstract. They feel personal. Ethan followed her gaze toward the skyline, thoughtful once more. For years he had attended events like this with practiced composure, discussing charitable initiatives with the careful distance expected of someone in his position. Yet standing beside Amara tonight had quietly altered the experience. She did not treat the evening as a performance or a responsibility. She treated it as something real. As the orchestra's music drifted softly through the ballroom and guests continued their conversations around them, Ethan realized that the arrangement he had designed with precise logic was beginning to produce something far less predictable. The woman beside him was not only changing how others saw his sudden marriage. She was beginning to change how he himself understood it. The evening gradually moved toward its final hour as the ballroom softened into a quieter atmosphere. The earlier curiosity of the crowd now replaced with comfortable conversation and the gentle rhythm of the orchestra playing near the stage. Waiters passed between tables collecting empty glasses while the guests who remained gathered in smaller groups, speaking with the relaxed tone that often appeared once formal expectations had faded. Ethan Callahan and Amara Johnson stood near the balcony doors once again, the cool night air drifting inside through a slightly open panel of glass. From this height, Central Park looked like a dark ribbon across the glowing city, and the distant lights of Midtown shimmered across the skyline like quiet stars. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Ethan rested one hand lightly against the balcony railing, watching the movement of traffic far below, as if the distance allowed him to think more clearly. Finally, he turned slightly toward Amara. "You handled tonight better than most people in this room expected," he said calmly. Amara glanced at him with mild curiosity. "That sounds like a compliment delivered with careful precision." Ethan allowed a small breath of amusement to pass. "Precision is usually necessary in my world." Amara looked back toward the city lights before replying. "People sometimes assume quiet confidence means someone has something to prove. Often it simply means they have nothing to hide." Ethan studied her expression again, noticing the calm certainty in her voice. The comment lingered in his thoughts longer than he anticipated. Before he could respond, another voice approached from behind them. "Ethan," a man said, warmly as he stepped forward from the nearby crowd. Ethan turned to see Robert Sinclair, a longtime business associate and one of the Foundation's largest contributors. Robert extended a hand in greeting before nodding politely toward Amara. "Mrs. Callahan, it is good to finally meet you. I must say the evening has been more interesting than expected." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "Interesting in what way?" Robert chuckled softly. "New York has been speculating all week about your sudden marriage. Many people assumed tonight would feel staged." He gestured lightly around the ballroom. "Instead, it seems remarkably natural." Amara responded with a calm smile. "Sometimes the simplest arrangements work best when people stop trying to analyze them too closely." Robert laughed with genuine approval. "That may be the most practical observation I have heard all evening." After exchanging a few more polite words, Robert excused himself, leaving the couple once again near the balcony doors. Ethan remained silent for several seconds, his attention drifting between the city lights and the woman standing beside him. Finally, he spoke again, his tone thoughtful rather than distant. "When I proposed this arrangement, I assumed public appearances would require careful coordination." Amara looked at him curiously. "And now?" Ethan paused briefly before answering. "Now it seems that standing beside you requires less effort than I predicted." The admission surprised even him slightly. Amara did not respond immediately. She simply looked out across the glowing skyline for a moment before speaking quietly. "Perhaps that is because neither of us is pretending very hard." Ethan considered the words carefully. In a life built on structured decisions and calculated expectations, the idea of something unfolding naturally felt unfamiliar. Yet as the music softened and the final conversations of the evening drifted across the ballroom, he realized that the woman beside him had quietly introduced a new variable into his carefully ordered world. And for the first time in a very long time, Ethan Callahan was not entirely certain what the outcome would be. The final moments of the evening arrived quietly, as many meaningful moments often do. The orchestra had softened into a gentle, closing melody and several guests had already begun gathering their coats. The earlier energy of the ballroom gradually settling into calm conversation and polite farewells. Outside the tall glass windows, the Manhattan skyline shimmered in the deep blue of late night, thousands of lights reflecting across the dark sky like scattered constellations. Ethan Callahan and Amara Johnson stepped out onto the balcony for a moment of quiet air, leaving behind the warm glow and steady murmur of the ballroom. The cool breeze carried the distant sounds of the city far below, taxis moving through intersections, the soft echo of traffic drifting upward through the towers. Amara rested her hands lightly against the smooth railing, looking out over Central Park where the long stretch of trees formed a dark silhouette beneath the city lights. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The quiet felt natural rather than awkward, a rare pause between two people whose lives had changed suddenly, but had not yet fully settled into their new rhythm. Ethan stood beside her with his usual composed posture, though his thoughts were moving through unfamiliar territory. He had attended dozens of events like this over the years, each one carefully managed with the same professional calm that defined his public life. Yet tonight had unfolded differently. Instead of controlling every detail of the narrative surrounding him, he had simply stood beside someone who spoke honestly and allowed the evening to develop naturally. Finally, he broke the silence. "You were not intimidated tonight." It was not a question. Amara smiled faintly while still looking out across the city. People who grow up in large cities learn early that rooms full of strangers are simply rooms full of people. Ethan studied her profile thoughtfully. Most people spend years trying to become comfortable in rooms like that one. Amara turned slightly toward him now. Perhaps they spend those years trying to become someone they are not. Ethan considered the answer carefully. The truth of the observation was difficult to ignore. For most of his life, every environment he entered had carried expectations. Business negotiations required confidence. Public events required composure. Even charity work often required a careful balance of generosity and reputation. Yet Amara had stepped into that same environment without trying to perform a role at all. She had simply been present. The result had been more convincing than any strategy he could have arranged. After a moment, Amara spoke again, her voice calm. "Earlier you said something interesting." Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly. "What was that?" "You said standing beside me required less effort than you expected." Ethan nodded once. "I did say that." Amara looked out at the city lights again before continuing. "I think it works both ways." Ethan watched her quietly, waiting for the rest of the thought. When two people agree to an arrangement, they usually try to protect themselves from disappointment. But sometimes expectations make things more complicated than they need to be. Ethan leaned lightly against the railing beside her, the cool night air moving through the quiet space between them. For the first time since the contract had been signed, he realized something unexpected about the woman beside him. She did not seem concerned with what the arrangement meant for the future. She simply accepted the present moment exactly as it was. And that calm acceptance had begun to change something inside his carefully structured world. As the final guests began leaving the ballroom behind them, and the orchestra played its last notes of the evening, Ethan Callahan understood a quiet truth he had not anticipated when the marriage began. The arrangement had been created to solve a problem. Yet standing beside Amara Johnson beneath the lights of the city, he began to wonder whether it might eventually become something far more meaningful than either of them had planned. The gala slowly came to an end as the last guests began leaving the Metropolitan Grand Ballroom, their quiet conversations fading into the soft echo of footsteps across polished marble floors. Outside, the night air had grown cooler, and Manhattan glowed with the steady pulse of late evening life. Ethan Callahan and Amara Johnson returned inside from the balcony, just as the orchestra finished its final piece, the lingering notes dissolving into polite applause from the remaining guests. Staff members moved efficiently through the room, clearing glasses and dimming sections of the chandeliers as the elegant gathering gradually dissolved into silence. Ethan paused for a moment near the entrance of the ballroom, glancing once more across the nearly empty room that had, only hours earlier, been filled with curious eyes and quiet speculation. Now those same conversations had carried something different as people left. Not confusion, not skepticism, something closer to respect. Amara adjusted the light shawl resting across her shoulders and looked toward Ethan with a calm expression. "The evening went better than most people expected," she said gently. Ethan nodded once. "That includes me." They walked together toward the main entrance where their car waited outside, beneath the warm lights of the building. The driver opened the door as they approached, but Ethan paused briefly before stepping inside, glancing back toward the glowing windows of the ballroom one last time. For years, events like this had followed a familiar pattern in his life. Appearances were carefully managed, conversations measured, impressions calculated with quiet precision. Tonight had been different in a way he had not anticipated. The difference was not the event itself, nor the charity, nor the people in attendance. The difference was the woman standing beside him. Amara had not tried to adapt herself to the expectations of the room. She had simply carried herself with quiet dignity, speaking honestly, and listening with genuine attention. And somehow that had altered the tone of the entire evening. They stepped into the car, and the door closed softly behind them. As the vehicle moved through the city streets, the lights of Manhattan passed across the windows in long reflections of gold and silver. For a few minutes neither of them spoke. The quiet was comfortable now, no longer the careful distance of two strangers bound only by a contract. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. When we created this arrangement, I believe the rules were simple. Amara turned slightly toward him. 1 year. Privacy. No expectations. Ethan nodded. Exactly. Amara waited for him to continue. Ethan looked out the window for a moment before finishing his thought. Tonight, I realized something unexpected. Arrangements are easier to manage than people. Amara smiled softly. That sounds like something someone learns after trying to control both. Ethan gave the faintest hint of a smile in return. Perhaps. The car slowed as it approached the entrance of the penthouse building. When the doors opened and they stepped into the quiet lobby, the city's noise faded behind them once again. Moments later, the elevator carried them silently upward toward the top floor. As the doors opened to the familiar calm of the penthouse hallway, Ethan paused before walking toward his office. Amara turned toward the corridor leading to her room, but his voice stopped her gently. Amara. She looked back. Ethan stood there for a moment, his expression thoughtful in a way she had not seen before. Then he spoke quietly, his tone no longer distant. Tonight did not feel like an arrangement. The hallway fell silent for a brief moment as the words settled in the air between them. Amara studied his expression carefully before answering with the same calm honesty she had carried all evening. Perhaps that is because we stopped treating it like one. Neither of them spoke again for a moment. Yet somewhere in the quiet space of the penthouse, beneath the distant glow of the city lights beyond the windows, something had changed. What had begun as a carefully written contract was slowly becoming something neither of them had planned. And for the first time since the agreement had been signed, neither Ethan Callahan nor Amara Johnson seemed in a hurry to define what that change might become.